Hello students, today we will discuss about T.S. Eliot, who is a famous poet, playwright, literary critic and editor. He was born in 1888 in St. Louis. He was the son of a prominent industrialist who came from a well-connected Boston family. Eliot always felt the loss of his family's New England roots and seemed to be somewhat ashamed of his father's business success. Throughout his life, he continually sought to return to the epicenter of Anglo Saxon culture, first by attending Harvard and then by emigrating to England, where he lived from 1914 till his death. Eliot began graduate study in philosophy at Harvard and completed his dissertation, although the outbreak of World War prevented him from taking his examination and receiving the degree. By that time, though, Eliot had already written the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and the war which kept him in England led him to decide to pursue poetry full time. He is best known as a leader of the modernist movement in poetry and as the author of such works as The Wasteland in 1922 and Four Quartets in 1943. One of the most prominent modernist poets of his time, T.S.Eliot, was perhaps the representative poet of his movement. He was the face of a radical shift from Victorian techniques into new, revolutionary ones. He was probably the most erudite poet of his time in the English language. His undergraduate poems were literary and conventional. His first important publication and the first masterpiece of modernism in English was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It was written in 1915. Eliot poetry, much like that of his contemporaries, explored the themes of isolation, fragmentation, and alienation in a cosmopolitan world. The intense fragmentation in his works, like The Wasteland and The Journey of the Magi, projects a sense of a large but fragmented world. His works were rich with literary allusions to cater to the larger design of his poems. He explored the theme of the artist in society and the isolation he must face. Eliot rejected the idea of the center, so to speak. His poetry is rich with uncertainty, acting as antithesis of Victorian art. This sense of uncertainty at the face of remarkable change is present in the journey of the Magi, in which the Magi are alienated, trapped between two worlds that symbolizes the old order and the new. A similar theme recurs in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, as the speaker is always lost in thought in the middle of something. Critics have always wondered where the speaker is headed psychologically, perhaps because there is always an internal conflict that plagues the speaker. This conflict leads to fragmented image in the poem, an image that permeates the work of T.S. Eliot. His work have been noted for their intensity and transgression. T.S. Eliot still remains an influential force in the history of literary tradition. Eliot met Ezra Pound in 1914 as well, and it was Pound who was his main mentor and editor, who got his poems published and noticed. During a 1921 break from his job as a bank clerk to recover from a mental breakdown, Eliot finished the work that was to secure his fame, The Wasteland. This poem, heavily edited by Pound and perhaps also by Eliot's wife Vivian, addressed the fragmentation and alienation characteristics of modern culture, making use of these fragments to create a new kind of poetry. It was also around this time that Eliot began to write criticism, partly in an effort to explain his own methods. In 1925, he went to work for the publishing house Faber and Faber. Despite the distraction of his wife's increasingly serious bouts of mental illness, Eliot was from this time until his death the preeminent literary figure in the English-speaking world. Indeed, he was so monumental that younger poets often went out of their way to avoid his looming shadow, painstakingly avoiding all similarities of style. Eliot and Pound, like their 18th century counterpart, set about reforming poetic diction, whereas Wordsworth thought he was going back to the real language of man. Eliot struggled to create new verse rhythms based on the rhythms of contemporary speech. He sought a poetic diction that might be spoken by an educated person, being neither pedantic nor vulgar. Eliot used the phrase objective correlative in the context of his own impersonal theory of poetry. It thus had an immense influence towards correcting the vagueness of late Victorian rhetoric. By insisting on a correspondence of word and object, two other essays first published the year after, The Sacred Wood almost complete, the Eliot Critical Canon, The Metaphysical Poets, and Andrew Marvell, published in selected essays between 1917 to 32. In these essays, he affects a new historical perspective on the hierarchy of English poetry, putting at the top Donne and other metaphysical poets of the 17th century and lowering poets of the 18th and 19th century. Eliot's second famous phrase appears here: dissociation of sensibility, invented to explain the change that came over English poetry after Donne and Andrew Marvell. This change seems to him to consist of a loss of the union of thought and feeling. The phrase has been attacked, yet the historical fact that gave rise to it cannot be denied. And with the poetry of Eliot and Pound, it had a strong influence in reviving interest in certain 17th century poets. Eliot's criticism and poetry are so interwoven that it is difficult to discuss them separately. The great essay on Dante appeared 2 years after Eliot was confirmed in the Church of England in 1927. In that year, he also became a British subject. The first long poem after his conversion was Ash Wednesday in 1930, a religious meditation in a style entirely different from that of an early poems. Ash Wednesday expresses the pangs and the strain involved in the acceptance of religious belief and religious discipline. This and subsequent poems were written in a more relaxed, musical, and meditative style than his earlier works, in which the dramatic element had been stronger than the lyrical. Ash Wednesday was not well received in an era that held that poetry, though autonomous, is strictly secular in its outlook. It was misinterpreted by some critics as an expression of personal disillusion. The first or pragmatic phase of Eliot's criticism ended with the use of poetry and the use of criticism in 1933. His Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. Shortly before this, his interest had broadened into theology and sociology. 3 short books or long essays were the result: Thoughts After Lambeth, The Idea of a Christian Society, and Notes Toward the Definition of Culture. These book essays, along with his Dante, an indubitable masterpiece, broadened the base of literature into theology and philosophy. Whether a work is great poetry must be decided by standards higher than the literary standards. Eliot plays, which begin with Sweeney Agnostics, published in 1926, first performed in 1934, and end with The Elder Statesman, first performed 1958, published in 1959, are, with the exception of Murder in the Cathedral, published and performed in 1935, inferior to the lyric and meditative poetry. Eliot's belief that even secular drama attracts people who unconsciously seek a religion led him to put drama above all other forms of poetry. All his plays are in blank verse of his own invention, in which the metrical effect is not apprehended. Apart from the sense thus he brought poetic drama back to the popular stage. The Family Reunion and Murder in the Cathedral are Christian tragedies, the former a tragedy of revenge, the latter of the sin of pride. Murder in the Cathedral is a modern miracle play on the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. The most striking feature of this, his most successful play, is the use of the chorus in the traditional Greek manner to make apprehensible to common humanity The meaning of the heroic action, the family reunion, was less popular. It contains scenes of great poignancy and some of the finest dramatic verse since the Elizabethan, but the public found the translation of the story of Orestes into a modern domestic drama baffling and was uneasy at the mixture of psychological realism. Mythical apparitions, a drawing room window, and a comic chorus of uncle and aunts. Eliot exercised a strong influence on Anglo American culture from the 1920s until late in the century. His experiments in diction, style, and versification revitalized English poetry, and in a series of critical essays, he shattered old orthodoxies and erected new ones. With the publication in 1922 of his poem The Wasteland, Eliot won an international reputation. The Wasteland expressed with great power the disenchantment, disillusionment, and disgust of the period after World War I. The publication of four quartets led to his recognition as the greatest living English poet and man of letters, and in 1948 he was awarded both the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Eliot became interested in religion in the later 1920s and eventually converted to Anglicanism. His poetry from this point onward shows a great religious bent. His last major poetic work combines a Christian sensibility with a profound uncertainty resulting from the vast devastation of Europe. Eliot died in 1965 in London. Now, in the next class, we will discuss about his poem Preludes. Thank you.